The notice was taped to his door on a Tuesday morning, 30 days to vacate. His whole world, this tiny barber shop, was about to be sold to developers. So when the disheveled old man walked in that afternoon, George saw only a person in need. He gave him a free haircut, a hot towel, and his last ounce of dignity. He had no idea the man owned the entire building. George was a single father of a 7-year-old girl, and this shop was their only security. Every snip of the scissors paid for her school, their apartment, their life. The building's sale meant ruin. So as he trimmed the stranger's silver hair, treating him with a care the world had seemingly forgotten, a question hung in the air between them, a test George never knew he was taking. In a city measuring worth in square footage, what is the true value of one man's kindness? The shop was called George's Chair, a 10 by 15-foot sanctuary of warm wood, bay rum, and steady hands. He'd built it from nothing 7 years ago, right after his wife, Claire, passed. The cancer took her quickly, leaving him with a 2-year-old daughter and a grief so vast he could only navigate it one haircut at a time. This was his therapy. The rhythmic snip of scissors, the focus required for a clean fade, it was a meditation that kept the world from crumbling. His daughter, Lily, was his why. Every afternoon at 3:15, she'd burst through the door, her backpack thumping against the vintage leather chairs, her small world orbiting this tiny shop. She did her homework in the corner, her drawings of their family, dad with scissors, mom as an angel, taped proudly to the mirror. This wasn't just a business. It was her inheritance, the only tangible piece of stability he could promise her. The building, a 4-story brick walk-up on a tree-lined street that was rapidly gentrifying, had been his lifeline. The rent was manageable. The landlord was a silent LLC that mailed invoices without fuss. For years, it was perfect. Then 6 weeks ago, the first letter arrived. Not a rent increase, but a formal notice of intent to sell. The entire block was being packaged for a developer who saw rows of historic facades and imagined glass condominiums. The pressure was a constant, silent hum beneath the buzz of his clippers. He'd lay awake at night, calculating, scrambling. A new location would require a deposit he didn't have, licensing transfers, starting over. Lily would have to change schools. The arithmetic of despair always ended in the same impossible sum. So when the elderly man shuffled in that fateful afternoon, George saw a reflection of his own precariousness. The man's coat was frayed, his posture carried the weight of forgotten corners. He asked softly if a trim was possible, his eyes avoiding George in a way that spoke of shame. George didn't ask for money, he simply gestured to the chair. "Let's get you fixed up." The ritual began. The hot towel, the precise application of lather, the careful glide of the razor. George worked with a solemn respect. The kind he'd learned wasn't about the haircut, but about restoring a person to themselves. He asked gentle questions, learned the man's name was Henry. Henry spoke little, but his eyes, a sharp, pale blue, missed nothing. They watched George's hands, they noted the photos of Lily, they lingered on the eviction notice, now yellowed, still pinned reluctantly to the corkboard. As George dusted the stray hairs from Henry's shoulders, the bell above the door chimed with a sharp, impatient ring. A woman in a sleek gray pantsuit stood in the doorway, a clipboard pressed to her chest. Samantha Vance, the real estate agent representing the building's sale. Her expression was a practiced mask of polite urgency. "George, we need to talk. The buyer's timeline has moved up. They want possession in 3 weeks. Her voice was clean, clinical, cutting through the warm, scented air. George felt the familiar knot tighten in his stomach. He kept his voice steady, his hands still on Henry's shoulders. "Ms. Vance, we agreed on 30 days. I'm trying. I've called every listing." "It's out of my hands," she said, not unkindly, but with the finality of someone reciting a script. "The contract is signed. The new owner is very decisive." Her gaze flickered to Henry, then back to George, a faint, unreadable flicker in her eyes. Was it pity, impatience, something else? Henry, in the chair, had gone very still. He didn't turn to look at the agent. He just stared straight ahead into the mirror, his freshly trimmed reflection looking decades younger, and suddenly, profoundly calm. George paid the agent no more mind than one would a fly buzzing at a window. He finished with Henry, carefully applying a bit of pomade. "There you are, sir, good as new." Henry stood slowly. He patted his pockets in a vague gesture, but George shook his head. "On the house, you have a good day now." For a long moment, Henry just looked at him. That piercing blue gaze held George, and in it George saw not gratitude but something deeper, an assessment, a verdict. Henry gave a single, slow nod. Then, without a word to the waiting agent, he walked out, the old coat hanging differently on his now squared shoulders. Samantha Vance let out a small, exasperated sigh. George, sentimentality doesn't pay the bills for these people. You just gave your work away to a homeless man while your own roof is about to be sold out from under you. Do you see the problem? George finally turned to her, the towel in his hands. I see a man who needed a haircut. That's my job. Your job is to run a viable business in a prime location, she corrected, her tone hardening. Which, as of 3 weeks from today, you will not be doing. She placed a business card on the counter. That's the buyer's representative. Good luck. She left, the door clicking shut with a sound of utter finality. The shop was silent, the air still heavy with the scent of Henry's aftershave and the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light. George picked up the card. It was heavy, embossed. The name meant nothing to him, Alden Holdings. He looked at Lily's drawings on the mirror. He looked at the empty chair where Henry had sat. And for the first time, a cold, sharp suspicion cut through his despair. Henry's eyes. They weren't the eyes of a defeated man. They were the eyes of a man who had been watching, judging, measuring everything in the room. Who was Henry? And why, as Samantha Vance delivered her eviction ultimatum, had she glanced at him with a look that wasn't disdain, but something closer to fear? The silence in the shop after Samantha left was deafening, broken only by the slow tick of the antique clock above the mirror. George stared at the embossed card. Alden Holdings, he never heard of them, but the weight of the paper suggested money, lots of it. His mind replayed the last hour in a frantic loop. Henry's sharp, observing eyes, the way he'd gone still at the mention of the new owner, Samantha's peculiar, flickering glance. It was probably nothing, he told himself, paranoia born of desperation. He tucked the card away and finished his day on autopilot, sweeping up Henry's grey clippings, disinfecting the chair. When Lily arrived, her chatter about a school project was a welcome anchor to normality. He didn't mention the tightened deadline. He just made her favorite pasta and listened, the card burning a hole in his apron pocket. That night after Lily was asleep, curiosity got the better of him. He typed Alden Holdings into his phone. The search results were surprisingly sparse for a company buying entire city blocks. A few vague business registry listings, no website, no photos. It was a ghost. But one buried article from a financial digest, 5 years old, mentioned Alden in passing. It referred to the firm as a closed, legacy investment vehicle for the Aldridge family fortune. Aldridge, the name rang a distant, historical bell. He scrolled further, obituaries, philanthropy announcements. And then he found it, a black and white photo from the 1960s, a young, sharp-faced man standing before a newly constructed brick building. The caption read, Real Estate Scion Harold Aldridge at the opening of his first solo project, the Mercer Building. The building in the grainy photo was unmistakable. It was his building. George's blood ran cold. Harold Aldridge, Henry. The man he'd taken for homeless was the original architect, the namesake, the source of the fortune now evicting him. But that made no sense. Why would the building's billionaire founder be wandering in, looking destitute, on the day his company was finalizing its sale? A test. The word landed in his gut with the weight of truth. It was the only explanation that fit the piercing assessment in Henry's eyes. The next morning, George opened the shop with a new, simmering anxiety. He half expected Henry to return to reveal himself, but the day passed with only regular clients. He called the number on Samantha Vance's card, bracing for a confrontation with some faceless corporate lackey. A polite, automated voice informed him the mailbox was full. He was being ghosted by a billionaire. 2 days later, the tension broke, not with Henry, but with Samantha Vance. She returned, but the woman who walked in was not the cool, clinical agent from before. She was pale, her professional composure cracked. She carried no clipboard. George, she said, her voice unsteady, we need to talk, off the record. He put down his scissors, heart hammering. Is it about the 3 weeks? It's about Henry, she breathed out, looking over her shoulder as if afraid of being followed. The man who was in here, do you know who he is? I think I do, George said quietly. Harold Aldridge, she confirmed, the name sounding like a relic in the small shop. He doesn't just own the company buying the building, George. He is asterisk the company. He's the sole owner of Alden Holdings. The sale isn't to some outside developer. He's selling the building from one of his own entities to another. He's been evaluating the tenants. George felt the floor tilt. Evaluating. For the last 6 months, Samantha whispered, leaning in, he's been visiting all his old properties, the ones from the start of his portfolio, dressing down, walking in, seeing how people treat him. The coffee shop on the corner kicked him out. The dry cleaners overcharged him for a special handling fee. The boutique next door pretended they didn't see him. She looked at George, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. You're the only one who offered him anything. And you gave him a free haircut while your own notice was on the wall. The information washed over George, a surreal wave. It was a loyalty test, a morality play on a billion-dollar scale. What does that mean for the sale? He asked, his voice tight. I don't know, Samantha admitted. My firm was just hired to facilitate the transaction. We got our instructions from an intermediary. I didn't even know it was him until yesterday. He summoned me to his office. He knew everything about my conversation with you, the way I spoke to you, the way I dismissed Henry. She shivered. He asked me one question. Do you believe compassion is a viable business model? I didn't know how to answer. Before George could process this, the shop door opened again. A uniformed delivery man entered, holding a long, narrow box of polished walnut. Delivery for Mr. George, he said, placing it carefully on the counter. It bore no return address, only George's name in elegant, handwritten script. With trembling hands, George opened the hinged lid. Inside, nestled on deep blue velvet, was not a legal document, but a single, pristine Barber's straight razor. Its handle was mother-of-pearl, its steel blade gleaming with a mirror finish. It was an antique, a master craftsman's tool, worth more than his rent for a year. Tucked beside it was a small, cream-colored card. The handwriting matched the box. A craftsman recognizes another. Your hands hold dignity. I would like to discuss the future of your chair. Please be at the building's rooftop garden this evening at 7. H.A. Samantha stared at the razor, then at George. That's his personal stationery. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by pure, stunned disbelief. He's inviting you to negotiate. The rest of the day was a blur. George moved through his appointments mechanically, the invitation feeling like a live wire in his pocket. He was no longer a barber facing eviction. He was a participant in a game whose rules he didn't understand, played by a man who could reshape the city on a whim. Was this a reward, a cruel joke, another, deeper test? At 10 to 7, with Lily at a neighbor, George took the building's old service elevator to the top floor, then climbed the final flight of stairs to the roof access door. He pushed it open, and the city evening spread out before him, but the rooftop was not the barren concrete he expected. It was a secret garden. Climbing roses wound up trellises, small trees grew in ornate planters, and fairy lights twinkled in the gathering dusk. At the center, at a small iron table set for two, sat Henry Aldridge. He was no longer in the frayed coat. He wore a simple but exquisitely tailored navy suit. He looked every inch the patriarch, but his eyes were the same, piercing, intelligent, and now openly appraising. George, he said, his voice firmer, clearer than it had been in the shop. Thank you for coming. Please sit. George approached slowly, taking in the surreal contrast between this oasis and the struggling shops 4 stories below. Mr. Aldridge. Henry, please, he gestured to the chair. I find formality obscures truth. He poured 2 glasses of water from a crystal pitcher. You've spoken with Miss Vance, I presume, so you know the shape of the game. Was it a game? George asked, sitting his guard up. An assessment, Henry corrected. This building was my first. I was 24. I believed then that buildings were about legacy, about creating spaces where good lives could unfold. He looked out over the skyline, his face etched with memory. Over 60 years, you see things. You see greed replace community. You see facades valued over foundation. I became a ghost in my own empire, a signature on checks. I wanted to remember what I built, and more importantly, who I built it for. He turned his gaze back to George. You treated a stranger with respect, not because you thought he was rich, but because you thought he was poor. That is a rare currency. You saw a man, not a transaction. In my world, that is the most radical act of all. George felt a surge of defensive anger. With all due respect, sir, that radical act doesn't pay my rent. My daughter's stability isn't a philosophical point, it's her life. Henry nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. Good, you defend what matters. That is the second part of the test. Compassion without backbone is just sentiment. He leaned forward. The sale of this building is proceeding. The new entity, a condo development, is real. George's heart sank. So this was just a billionaire's whimsical morality tale before the bulldozers arrived. However, Henry continued, I have retained one parcel from the sale, the ground floor commercial unit currently occupied by George's chair. He let the words hang in the fragrant air. The property is being transferred into a new trust, a trust that would own the space and offer a perpetual lease to its occupant, at a rate of $1 per year. The world seemed to stop. The sounds of the city faded. George could only stare. $1, he repeated, the words meaningless. A token, Henry said. The trust's mandate is simple, to preserve a business that demonstrates that a community's value is measured by its humanity, not its square footage. Your skill is your equity. Your character is your collateral. It was too much. It was a fairy tale. Why, George managed to ask, why me? Why go to all this trouble? Henry's stern expression softened just for a moment. Because George, decades ago when I was a young man sweating over blueprints and bank loans, a barber in a shop much like yours gave me my first professional haircut on credit. He told me, a man who respects his own appearance will learn to respect his promises. He saw my ambition and treated it with dignity, not doubt. I never forgot that. I've been looking for his successor ever since. I believe I've found him. He slid a single-page document across the table. It was a letter of intent outlining the trust. This is not charity, it is an investment in a standard. You will run your business. You will continue to serve who you wish, how you wish. The only condition is that you stay, that you remain a fixed point of kindness in a revolving door of deals. George looked at the paper, then at the skyline, then back at the old man's expectant face. A lifetime of struggle, a future of security for Lily, all hinging on this moment. It felt like a dream, but the parchment was real, the offer tangible. What about the other tenants? George asked, thinking of the coffee shop owner, the dry cleaner. Henry's face returned to its unreadable mask. They made their choices, as I made mine. This is not about saving everyone. It is about honoring what is worth preserving. He stood, signaling the meeting was over. Do not answer now. Take the document. Show it to a lawyer you trust. Think of your daughter. Then in 3 days, tell me your decision. He began to walk toward the stairwell, then paused. Oh, and George, the razor is a gift. No strings. A craftsman should have the finest tools. And with that, Harold Henry Aldridge disappeared back into the shadows of his own making, leaving George alone in the rooftop garden with a piece of paper that could rewrite his destiny, and a chilling, unanswered question hanging in the twilight. What is the true cost of a gift from a king? The document felt like a ghost in his hands, weightless yet pulling him toward an abyss of impossible fortune. George descended from the rooftop garden back into the stark reality of his shop, the letter of intent searing a hole in his pocket. He didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table, the single page under the lamplight, reading and rereading the sparse, powerful clauses. A trust, $1, perpetual. Words that promised a future so secure, it felt like a betrayal of every hard lesson life had taught him. The next morning, he did as Henry suggested. He went to see Arthur Fields, a grizzled, no-nonsense property lawyer who had helped him with his initial lease. Arthur scanned the document, his eyebrows climbing higher with each line until they nearly disappeared into his receding hairline. He took off his glasses, polished them slowly, and sighed. George, he said, his voice grave, this is either the most generous thing I've ever seen or the most elegantly constructed trap. A trap? George asked, his stomach tightening. It's a unilateral declaration of intent from a man who controls assets worth more than some small countries. It outlines a beautiful idea, but it's not a contract. It names no trustee. It specifies no legal entity for this trust. It's a promise from a ghost. If Harold Aldridge dies tomorrow, this paper is worth less than the ink it's printed on. His heirs, his board, They could tear it up and laugh you out of court. The euphoria of the rooftop curdled into a familiar, sickening anxiety. So what do I do? You get him to formalize it, immediately. A full, binding trust deed filed with the county, with an independent trustee, a bank, a law firm, someone who outlives him. And you, my friend, need to prepare for the storm that's coming. What storm? Arthur gave him a pitying look. You think you're going to get $1 billion reprieve and the world will just applaud. The other tenants are getting eviction notices. The developers are salivating over that prime ground floor retail space you're sitting on. When they find out it's been carved out of the deal and given to Barber for $1, they will come for you. They will dig into your life, your finances, your past. They will paint you as a con man or a charity case. This gift will have claws, George. The warning was a bucket of ice water. George left Arthur's office feeling more vulnerable than before the rooftop. He had traded the clear and present danger of eviction for the shadowy, immense danger of being a pawn in a billionaire's game. He tried to return to normal. He cut hair. He smiled at clients. He picked up Lily from school. But the shop no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a glass box under a microscope. Samantha Vance called, her voice strained. Word is starting to leak, George. The buyer's legal team is asking why Unit G is suddenly off the table. They're furious. 2 days later, the storm Arthur predicted made landfall. A sleek black sedan pulled up outside the shop just before closing. A man in an impeccably cut charcoal suit emerged, followed by a younger woman carrying a tablet. He entered without ringing the bell. Mr. George, I'm Donovan Pierce, lead counsel for Crestline Developments, the acquiring entity for this property. His smile was a razor blade. We understand there's some confusion regarding the status of your tenancy. George wiped his hands on a towel, his heart pounding. No confusion, I have an arrangement with the owner. The previous owner, Pierce corrected smoothly. The sale is imminent. All existing arrangements are subject to review by the new ownership. Our plans for a cohesive luxury lobby require this specific footprint. He glanced around the shop with barely concealed disdain. We are prepared to offer you a generous relocation allowance to vacate peacefully by the original deadline. I'm not vacating, George said, forcing his voice to stay level. My arrangement is with Mr. Aldridge. It's permanent. Pierce's smile didn't waver. Mr. Aldridge is a brilliant man, but he is also 87 years old. His capacity to make binding, long-term commitments is, unfortunately, a matter of some legal debate among his representatives. We represent the future of this asset, and the future does not include a barbershop. The threat was naked. They would challenge Henry's mental competence. They would tie the gift up in courts until George was bankrupt from legal fees. The woman with the tablet subtly took a photo of the shop's interior. After they left, George felt the walls closing in. The offer wasn't a salvation, it was a target painted on his back. That evening, as he helped Lily with her spelling, his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. He answered. George, it's Ben from the coffee shop. The voice was tense, angry. Is it true? You cut a side deal with the old man, the rest of us are getting the boot, and you get to stay for free. It's not like that, Ben, George started, but the line went dead. The isolation was instantaneous. He was no longer a fellow victim. He was a traitor who had gotten lucky. The pressure built like a thunderhead. A local business blog ran a vague item about last-minute complications in the high-profile Mercer building sale, hinting at sentimental favoritism affecting the deal. The comments section was a swamp of vitriol, speculating about kickbacks and sob stories. George realized Henry's gift had thrown him into a deeper, more complex fight. He wasn't just battling for his shop. He was battling to prove that an act of kindness was a valid form of currency in a world that only understood force and contracts. On the morning of the third day, the day he was to give Henry his answer, George found a plain envelope slid under his shop door. No stamp, no name. Inside was a photocopied news article from 30 years ago. The headline read, "Tenant Advocate Wins Settlement Against Aldridge Empire." The article described a long legal battle where Harold Aldridge's company had aggressively and unsuccessfully tried to evict a rent-controlled tenant, an elderly woman. The young lawyer who had taken her case and one was named Martin Croft. At the bottom of the photocopy, in the same elegant hand as the rooftop note, was written, "My greatest teacher. He taught me that legacy without ethics is a monument to greed. Find him." It was a clue, a test within the test. Henry wasn't just offering a deal, he was offering a path to armor it. George spent the day frantically searching. Martin Croft was retired, but still listed with the state bar. He lived upstate. It was a 4-hour drive. With Lily at a sleepover, George got in his car and went. He found Croft on a small farm, a man in his 70s with sharp eyes and a stubborn set to his jaw. When George showed him the photocopied article and explained, Croft laughed, a dry, raspy sound. "So the old lion is still playing his games," Croft said, shaking his head. "He never could just give a gift, always had to make it a quest." He invited George in, poured him a whiskey and told the story. The battle had been brutal, personal. Aldridge had seen it as business. Croft had framed it as a moral imperative. In the end, Aldridge had settled, not because he had to, but because Croft had forced him to see the human cost in the courtroom. "He sent you to me because I know how to build a fortress around a promise," Croft said. "A trust with him as the sole benefactor is a house of cards, but a charitable remainder trust, with the building's space dedicated in perpetuity to community service and skilled trade preservation. With me as the interim trustee and a reputable bank as successor, that's a legal fortress. It becomes a mission, not a favor." It's much harder for a developer to argue against a defined charitable purpose than against one Barber's luck. He spent the next 2 hours sketching the structure on a legal pad. It was brilliant. It turned Henry's personal whim into a public benefit entity. It protected George, but it also fulfilled Henry's stated desire for a legacy of humanity. George drove back through the night, the blueprint for his defense glowing in his mind. He had his answer for Henry. He wouldn't just accept the gift. He would help forge it into something unbreakable. He arrived at the shop as the sun was rising, exhausted but clear-headed. He expected to find another note, another instruction. Instead, he found Samantha Vance waiting on the sidewalk, her face ashen. "George," she said, her voice a hollow whisper, "it's Henry. He had a stroke last night. He's in the ICU. It's not good." The world dropped out from under George. The architect of his potential future, the inscrutable judge, was suddenly a dying man. The entire delicate, terrifying arrangement hinged on one man's will and his capacity to enforce it, and that man was now unconscious. Donovan Pierce, the developer's lawyer, would be circling like a vulture. The trust, the plan, the fortress, none of it existed yet. All that existed was a handwritten note and a dying man's vague intention. Arthur the lawyer's warning echoed in his skull. "If Harold Aldridge dies tomorrow, this paper is worth less than the ink it's printed on." George looked at his shop, at the light just beginning to hit the red and white pole. The race was no longer about making a decision. It was a desperate sprint to solidify a dream before the only man who believed in it slipped away, leaving George to face the wolves with nothing but a story about kindness. The final, brutal question was no longer what the gift would cost, but whether it would exist at all. Time, which had stretched and contorted during Henry's games, now snapped forward with the brutal, linear urgency of a medical monitor. George stood frozen on the sidewalk, the legal blueprint from Martin Croft feeling like a map to a treasure that had just sunk into the ocean. Samantha Vance's words hung between them. The stroke changed everything. It made Henry's grand gesture look like the final, fading fantasy of a dying man. "Who's with him?" George asked, his voice tight. "His daughter, Elizabeth, and a battalion of lawyers and doctors. The family's private security has the floor locked down." Samantha hugged herself, looking lost. "I've been cut out, we all have." George made a decision then, born less from hope than from a refusal to let Henry's test end with his own surrender. "I need to get to the hospital. I need to speak to his daughter." "George, they won't let you within a mile of her." "Then you're going to get me in," he said, turning to her. "You're the only one who knows the whole story. You saw him in my shop. You know this wasn't just a whim. You delivered his invitation. You have credibility." She stared at him, fear warring with a dawning resolve. She had been a cog in a machine that was now crushing her too. Helping George was her only path out of being just another bystander. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." What followed was a sequence of quiet, urgent maneuvers. Samantha used her contacts to find out which hospital, which floor. She called in a favor with a nurse for temporary visiting credentials. They weren't going to see Henry, that was impossible. They were going to attempt an audience with Elizabeth Aldridge. They arrived at the austere private wing of the city's most exclusive hospital. The air was hushed, smelling of antiseptic and money. A stern man in a suit, not a uniform, stood outside a private family lounge. Samantha approached, her professional mask back in place. "Mr. Sterling, this is George. He's the barber from the Mercer building. Mr. Aldridge had a standing appointment with him. He's here to offer his condolences to the family." The guard's eyes swept over George, knotting his worn shoes, his simple jacket. He was about to refuse when the door to the lounge opened. A woman stood there. She was in her 50s, with Henry's sharp, intelligent blue eyes, but they were red-rimmed and exhausted. She wore a simple cashmere sweater and slacks, an outfit that screamed quiet wealth. "Sterling, it's fine," Elizabeth Aldridge said, her voice hoarse but commanding. "I know who he is." She looked at George. "My father talked about you. The barber with steady hands," he said. "Come in." George and Samantha entered the serene, awful room. The silence was punctuated by the faint, rhythmic beep of a monitor from a room beyond a closed door. Elizabeth didn't offer them a seat. She just looked at George, waiting. "I'm so sorry about your father," George began. "He's not gone yet," she interjected, her gaze unwavering. "But his capacity is. The doctors say even if he recovers, the man who drafted complex trusts and played cat and mouse with tenants is gone. So, Mr. George, you have 5 minutes. Why are you really here?" George laid it all out. He didn't plead. He presented the facts as Henry had orchestrated them: the test, the rooftop offer, the developer's immediate pushback, the warning from his own lawyer. Then he handed her the legal blueprint from Martin Croft. "Your father sent me to him. Croft helped me understand that the offer as it stood was a beautiful, fragile idea. But this," he tapped the paper, "this is how you make it real, a charitable remainder trust. It protects the intention, not just me. It turns his personal wish into a lasting legacy, a promise that outlives him." Elizabeth took the papers, her eyes scanning the dense legal language. She was silent for a long minute. "My father," she finally said, "spent a lifetime building monuments to his own name. In his later years, it haunted him. He wanted one thing that wasn't a transaction, one thing that was purely human." She looked up at George. "He believed he found that in your shop. I think I believe him." Then her expression hardened. "But you are correct. Intentions die with the person. Legacies require paperwork." She walked to a desk, picked up a phone, and spoke 2 words: "Bring Rhodes." Within minutes, an elderly man with a kind face and sharp eyes entered. Charles Rhodes, she explained, was not the family's corporate counsel. He was her father's personal attorney for over 40 years, the keeper of his true wishes. Rhodes examined Croft's blueprint, nodding slowly. "Harold discussed this general concept with me," Rhodes said. "He wanted a mechanism to reward integrity without creating a dependency. This structure, this is elegant. It honors his wish while insulating it from challenge. The charitable purpose is key." Elizabeth turned back to George. "We will establish this trust. Today, Rhodes will draft it, and I will execute it as my father's power of attorney. The space is yours, under the terms you and my father discussed." Relief, profound and dizzying, washed over George, but it was short-lived. "However," Elizabeth continued, "there is a condition my father did not mention. The $1-a-year lease is for you personally to operate George's chair as a barbershop. If you sell the business, retire, or cease to be the primary barber, the trust mandates that the space be offered at the same nominal rate to another small, independent trade focused on dignified service. A cobbler, a tailor, a watchmaker. The craft continues. The man is temporary. Do you understand?" George did. It was no longer a gift to him, but a gift through him. He was now a steward. "I understand." Good, Elizabeth's business was done, but as George turned to leave, she spoke again, softer. "He told me, in one of his clearer moments last week, Lizzie, that Barber has a daughter. He looks at her the way I wished I had always looked at you. Make sure she knows what this was really about." The legal machinery, once engaged, moved with breathtaking speed. With the full weight of the Aldridge family office behind it, the Mercer Street Legacy Trust was drafted, filed, and ratified in 72 hours. A press release, dry and legalistic, went out from the offices of Rhodes and Sterling, stating that as part of the building's sale, a ground floor unit had been placed into a permanent charitable trust to preserve a historic small business. Donovan Pierce and Crestline Developments were furious, but they were outmaneuvered and outgunned. Challenging a well-structured charitable trust with a powerful family behind it was a legal and PR nightmare they chose to avoid. They took their condo plans and adjusted them around the immutable fact of the barber shop. The news trickled out to the neighborhood. The reaction was mixed. Ben from the coffee shop never spoke to George again, but others, seeing the trust's charitable language, began to understand it wasn't a backroom deal. It was a bizarre, romantic footnote to the neighborhood's change. George became a local curiosity, a symbol of resistance against the faceless tide of development. The morning the sale of the building was finalized, George opened his shop as usual. The eviction notice was gone from his corkboard. In its place was the framed letter of intent from Henry, and next to it, the official trust deed. Lily came in after school, as always. She looked at the new frames. "So we get to stay forever?" she asked. "We get to stay as long as we're doing good work," George corrected gently. "And after us, someone else who does good work gets to stay." She thought about that, then nodded satisfied. "That's better." Life settled into a new rhythm. The fear of loss was replaced by the weight of purpose. George kept the antique straight razor in a display case, a reminder of the precarious thread on which his future had hung. Then, 6 months later, a final envelope arrived. This one was postmarked from Switzerland. Inside was a letter from Elizabeth Aldridge. "George, my father passed away peacefully last week. In his will, he left specific, personal bequests outside of the main estate. One is for you. Enclosed is a cashier's check. The instructions read, for his daughter's education, and for him to buy the building next door when it goes up for sale, so he'll never have a bad neighbor. It seems his sense of humor survived to the end. Use it well." The check was for a sum that took George's breath away. It wasn't billions. It was meaningful. It was thoughtful. It was Henry's final, precise cut, ensuring the story didn't end with security, but with the freedom to grow. George looked out his shop window, the red and white pole spinning steadily. He had passed a test he never knew he was taking, and in doing so had been woven into the legacy of a man who spent a lifetime building monuments, but only at the very end built something that felt like a home. The lesson was etched not in stone, but in trust, that in a world obsessed with value, the rarest currency is, and will always be, an unforced act of kindness. And sometimes, just sometimes, that currency spends better than gold. The story of George and Henry feels like a modern fable, a perfect arc of kindness rewarded. But beneath the satisfying symmetry lies a more challenging, enduring truth. This wasn't just about a lucky break. It was a collision between two value systems, one that measures worth in assets and square footage, and another that measures it in dignity and craft. Henry Aldridge, the billionaire in a worn coat, wasn't searching for someone to pity him. He was searching for someone who wouldn't. In a world where we are all constantly assessed by our clothes, our jobs, our accents, George performed a simple, radical act. He saw a person, not a proposition. And in doing so, he passed a test most of us fail every day, not because we're cruel, but because we're busy, distracted, conditioned to prioritize utility over humanity. The real lesson isn't that we should all give free haircuts in hopes of a billionaire's reward. The lesson is in the quiet mechanics of the trust Henry ultimately created. It wasn't designed to create a dependent. It was designed to preserve an example. George's security came not from a handout, but from the formal, legal recognition that his way of being in the world, treating skill with respect and people with dignity, had tangible, lasting value. It asked the question, what if we structured our world to protect that? We live in an age of relentless transaction. Every interaction can feel like an evaluation of what we can get. But the research into how the genuinely wealthy operate reveals a fascinating pattern. It's often not about lavish displays, but about silent observation. They watch how you treat the waiter, the receptionist, the stranger who can do nothing for you. that to them is the truest resume. Henry's test was simply an extreme, orchestrated version of this everyday reality. So the story leaves us with a mirror more than a map. It asks us to consider the invisible tests we all face and administer. When you encounter someone outside the hierarchy of perceived value, what is your instinct? To overlook, to tolerate, or to truly see? George's chair remains a small fortress of an old idea that how you treat people is not just a reflection of your character, but the very foundation of your legacy. If this story found a place in your thoughts, we'd love to know. Where are you watching from today? Share your city or country in the comments below. We read every single one. And tell us, what was the moment that stayed with you? Was it Henry's final, humorous bequest, the creation of the trust, or George's simple, decisive act of care at the beginning? If you believe the world needs more narratives that explore the hidden currencies of human connection, please hit that subscribe button. We are dedicated to bringing you more journeys into the heart of what truly matters. New stories are on the way, and we would be honored to have you with us for the next one. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being part of this community. Until next time, take care of your heart and remember, the most powerful legacy you can build is often written in the quiet, daily script